Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
This year, WUWM explored Milwaukee and Wisconsin's immigration history through a series called Making Wisconsin. The idea was to help better understand who our neighbors are and how immigration has shaped our city, state, and country. One part of the series explored the concept of sanctuary. Throughout history, there have been waves of sanctuary movements stemming from religious organizations, activists, and legislation. To help understand sanctuary and how it's shaped our history and politics, Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski spoke with Marquette University Assistant Professor of History and author Sergio González.
In U.S. immigration history, people have often defined the United States as a place of sanctuary for people all across the world, refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, people who are looking for a new opportunity or a sense of safety here in this country. When we think even more specifically, and I think if we think of the 21st century and 2025, sanctuary now has a very specific political connotation. And of course, that's very much connected to the question of immigration and the way in which immigration activists have taken up that term, especially since the 1980s, as a rallying cry to really create these spaces of safety for undocumented immigrants and refugees in this country.
So we're going to kind of wind the scope back and kind of go through a little chronological history, especially here in Wisconsin, but also the U.S., about sanctuary. So to localize it here, shall we start with the Underground Railroad in Wisconsin? And was this kind of one of our first big public moments of sanctuary?
Yeah, absolutely. If we think about sanctuary as this kind of founding mythology of the United States, that the U.S. has always been that way, different groups throughout American history have appropriated that language to their own ends. And I think one of the most dramatic examples is in the 19th century. Abolitionists who strongly objected to the institution of slavery, but didn't just object to it in their language and their ideas or even in what they wrote, but they actually enacted it through the material work that they did, which is to say that they created movements to try to help enslaved people flee indentured and servitude and move towards the north, either to northern states that did not have enslavement or maybe crossing over into the Canadian border. And so I'm sure that a lot of listeners are familiar with the Underground Railroad. They learned about it in elementary school, but people might not know that Wisconsin had these important stops all across the southeastern parts of the state that served in the 1850s all the way up until the early 1860s as important locations for people who were coming up from Missouri through Illinois, making their way through Wisconsin, and eventually through to Canada.
So we're going to bump up to the 1900s here, and a few key parts of our sanctuary history for European immigrants and, of course, the Great Migration in the 40s and 50s. So let's start with the Great Migration. How is this an example of both what you call real and failed sanctuary?
Yeah, I think so. Wisconsin had a late Great Migration. It's often referred to. I think people may know the Great Migration begins really in the early 20th century. But people who are leaving the U.S. South, Black Americans who are either fleeing economic deprivation or they're fleeing the Jim Crow South system that forces them to live in the second-class citizenship, those people start coming northward, and many of them kind of end up in Chicago, so they don't actually make it all the way up to Milwaukee. And our community doesn't really start to grow until the 1940s and 1950s in large numbers, Milwaukee's Black community. And when they arrive in Milwaukee looking for the exact same things that European immigrants had come to this country looking for in the 1850s, which is a new start and safety. Right, economic opportunity and not having to look over their shoulder and fearing either extrajudicial violence or violence by the state. And they arrive here in Milwaukee in the 1940s and 1950s, and sometimes they do find that, right? They certainly do find better economic opportunities here in Milwaukee than they would have found in places like Alabama or Mississippi. But they also find a new system of second-class citizenship. It's not as severe as the Jim Crow South. It's certainly not enacted with the form of violence that lives in places like Alabama or Mississippi. Mississippi, but they know they are made to feel like they don't belong. And that happens in a lot of different ways, whether that's at the work site, whether that's in where they're allowed to live, right? They're tightly constrained within this few blocks area that we now refer to as the near north side. Back then it was known as the urban core. And so Black Americans who arrive here in Milwaukee, who become Black Milwaukeeans and Black Wisconsinites, have to navigate all of these different factors.
And looking at post-World War II as well, especially in relation to European immigrants searching for sanctuary in a time of war, how did we as a nation fail to give safe harbor during the Holocaust specifically?
Yeah, I think most Americans know that the world turned a blind eye to what was happening in Europe, especially Western Europe, and in parts of Germany and Austria and Poland throughout the 1930s. And of course, this all becomes extremely apparent after the United States claims victory in Europe in 1945, and you have American soldiers who are going throughout Western Europe and they see concentration camps. And it becomes very clear to Americans who are abroad, and eventually as these images make their way across the world, that the country had failed to offer sanctuary to not only European Jews, but a wide assortment of people who had been victimized by the Nazi regime. And so there's an acknowledgement after 1945 that the world needs to do better, right? And so when the United Nations is formed after World War II, one of the most important things that they do is to establish a set of standards for how the world is responsible to deal with refugees, right? They set up this very clear standard on who is a refugee, and then the obligations or responsibilities of nation states to offer these people a sense of sanctuary, a sense of safe harbor. The entire concept of the refugee is kind of developed as a legal category after 1945. And, after that period, then the United States kind of haphazardly works their way trying to understand what's their obligation to this. The U.S. does not sign on to the UN human rights standard of what a refugee is in 1947. In fact, they don't adopt that fully until 1980. And one of the big reasons for that is the United States wants to be able to do their own deciding on what a refugee is and who they're going to bring into the nation. And so after 1945, the Cold War era, the United States continues to kind of work through, who is going to be allowed into this country under this idea of a refugee.
So you mentioned the 1980s, which is perhaps the next biggest and impactful wave of the sanctuary movement. So can you explain why this period is so important when we're talking about sanctuary in modern history?
Yeah, the 1980s is a period where sanctuary becomes a rallying cry for a growing movement of religiously motivated individuals who are working out of houses of worship, who see a growing number of people arriving from Central America, specifically from El Salvador and Guatemala. And these are people who arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border in the early 1980s, bearing very clear marks of the revolutions and the civil wars that they are fleeing, and specifically these repressive regimes that are sending death squads into rural areas, into urban spaces. And so Salvadorans and Guatemalans arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border. They try to avail themselves of the 1980 Refugee Act, which is this new piece of legislation that Congress has passed that has brought the U.S. into line with international human rights law. And that basically stipulates that if a person can demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country, they should be allowed to stay in the United States. The problem is that Salvadorans and Guatemalans witness a 97 to 98% rejection rate of their asylum applications. And so you have churches and synagogues in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. They see this happening. They're asking, why is this going on? And they quickly realize that this is all politically motivated. The Reagan administration is refusing to acknowledge these people as refugees because they would then have to acknowledge the United States' role in destabilizing those countries in the first place. Because at the same time, the U.S. is still sending hundreds of millions of dollars in money, in military support, in training to these countries. And so churches and synagogues decide they have to do something about it. In 1982, in Arizona and California, the first churches declare themselves places of sanctuary for these Central American asylum seekers. And they do so knowing that they might be seen as breaking the law by the federal government. Pretty soon that movement spreads all across the country, including here in Milwaukee. Milwaukee becomes the host to the first Latino, the first Black, and the first Jewish houses of worship to become sanctuaries for Salvadorans and Guatemalans during this era.
Now, 1986, Wisconsin Governor Tony Earl declared Wisconsin as a sanctuary state. So what does that actually mean, and how does that also give another example of that state versus federal tension that plays out.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of listeners would be surprised to learn that Wisconsin has been a sanctuary state since the 1980s. But of course, Governor Earl is aware of what's happening, of course, right? All Americans see what's happening here, especially when these federal charges are brought against these sanctuary workers. It becomes national news. And Governor Earl feels an obligation as an elected official here in the state to recommend that Wisconsinites get involved in this work, right? He also believes that the Reagan administration is in the wrong for sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Central America. He also believes that the Reagan administration is not fulfilling its legal obligation to offer these people asylum in this country under the 1980 Refugee Act. So in 1986, Governor Earl, in the middle of the campaign season, right, re-election, and he decides to declare Wisconsin a sanctuary state. Now, on paper, what it means, it's mostly a statement of support for the movement. And in fact, he invites Wisconsinites to join this work as well. He doesn't have the clear statements there, what it actually means for state employees or, if there's going to be financial contributions to this effort, which that never actually materializes. But it sends a clear statement on where he believes the state of Wisconsin should be and where Wisconsinites should stand on the question of sanctuary.
Gotcha. So our next kind of marker of sanctuary and the movement and higher activity of this movement is under former President George W. Bush's administration. And this is specifically post 9/11. So can you explain how this event kind of restarted the movement in a more public-facing way?
Yeah, the movement goes dormant after the early 1990s. The revolutions in Central America settled down. The U.S. begins to actually live up to its obligations on the Refugee Act. And so through much of the 90s, sanctuary doesn't really come into motion. It's really after 9/11 when the United States begins to ramp up its surveillance of undocumented communities. And there are growing calls to really connect questions of national security and national defense with immigration, which leads to militarization of the border, the creation of organizations like Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE. And so there are more and more undocumented people in this country who feel unsafe. They feel like they can't come out of the shadows, as is often referred to. They feel like they can't live their lives in this country. And so as there's a rising number of deportations, first under George W. Bush and then especially under President Barack Obama, houses of worship again jump into this work. There's a revival of sanctuary. In fact, the movement is reborn in about 2011, 2013 is when you start to see these really large, growing numbers of churches and synagogues get involved. They call themselves the New Sanctuary Movement. And now they're offering safe harbor not just to asylum seekers, but also to people who have lived in this country for 20 years, right? People from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Ecuador, from all parts of the world, in fact, who perhaps see themselves as Americans in all ways except for their legal documentation. They've established roots here, they have jobs here, they've had children here, and now they're fearing that they're going to be torn away from the very social fabric that makes them feel at home in this country. And so the New Sanctuary Movement kind of takes up that 100-year history of sanctuary in this country, 150-year plus history of sanctuary in this country, repackages it and becomes another vibrant movement, especially under the administrations of George W. Bush and Barack Obama.
So as you say, with the new sanctuary movement from George W. Bush up until today, and also with Trump's previous presidency, it's this kind of retaliation against the sanctuary movement being more broad, more encompassing. What are some of the anti-sanctuary things that are happening, whether it's on the federal level or just in public opinion?
Yeah, I think we have seen, of course, I always say that to talk about immigration politics in 2025 is to talk about anti-sanctuary politics. And the reason that is because sanctuary has served as such a robust form of rebuke to the federal government, whether it's in the 1980s, whether it's in that initiation of the new sanctuary movement, or specifically in the first election of Donald Trump in 2016. In 2017, we saw this kind of prairie fire spreading across the country, right? It was sanctuary kind of growing not just in religious spaces, but also in secular spaces. So the growth of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states as local municipalities made the decision to tell public employees to not participate in immigration enforcement. We saw things like the growth of sanctuary school districts and sanctuary campuses, heck, even things like sanctuary restaurants, right? And much of this was often a form of messaging to say that this is a place where we welcome immigrants regardless of their immigration status. But sometimes these actions actually had teeth, right? Which is to say that they actually served as a barrier for the federal government to enact some of the most punitive forms of immigration enforcement. So if it's an effective form of rebuke to the federal government, we might expect there to be a counter-movement towards that. And of course, in the last 10 years, we have seen the growth of these anti-sanctuary politics. In fact, Donald Trump in his second election here made sanctuary one of the cornerstones of his work, right? He has gone just very, very hard against sanctuary cities during his first term and in his second term. Within the first few hours of assuming power in the Oval Office, he signed executive orders in both terms against sanctuary cities, right? Trying to bring to heel these elected officials to force them to accommodate his immigration enforcement standards. And so it is kind of the history of social movements in this country, which is to say that if there's an effective social movement, there is going to be an effective counter-movement towards it as well. We are right now kind of living through the consequences of that. It is much too soon to tell what will be the outcome of this. We do know that across the federal government, whether it's at the executive branch or at the legislative branch, anti-sanctuary politics are gaining quite purchase right now.
Well, Sergio, I want to thank you so much for joining me to take a little historical deep dive into sanctuary. It's an important movement, and it's really interesting to dive into how it's changed over time.
Thanks for having me.
Sergio González is an assistant professor of history at Marquette University and the author of the books Stranger No Longer, Latino Belonging and Faith in 20th Century Wisconsin, and Mexicans in Wisconsin. He spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting WUWM.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.
How does AI even work? Where does creativity come from? What's the secret to living longer? TED Radio Hour explores the biggest questions with some of the world's greatest thinkers. They will surprise, challenge, and even change you. Listen to NPR's TED Radio Hour wherever you get your podcasts.